Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I am joined by my friend Kat from The Creative Introvert. Kat is my social media manager, and she helps to aggregate all of the questions that you guys ask throughout the year and put them together into these fun Q&A episodes. Kat is also a really great astrologer and has her own show and interviews that she does with people. So it's been really fun to have her techie expertise as well as to share astrological musings with her when we do these Q&A episodes together. So thanks for being here, Kat. And what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about whether or not we need to flip the zodiac. And this comes from, I think it's usually our friends down under who are wondering about the seasons and whether or not the zodiac changes depending on where you are in the world.
Right. So we recently did an episode, another Q&A episode that was titled what would happen if human beings moved to Mars? Would our astrology still work? Would we need a new astrology? So I recommend that you go back and listen to that episode that Kat and I did, because we're recording these consecutively and sort of building off from points that we made in that talk. So that talk will really give you a lot on this question, but we're going to build off from it too. So let's just revisit a few things that we said in that talk. One of them is that there was a very famous modern astrologer named Geoffrey Cornelius who wrote a book called The Moment of Astrology, and the subtitle is Origins and Divination. And the book is really about what kind of epistemology does astrology have? Meaning, what epistemology, just kind of briefly defined, is how do we know what we know? Or how do we understand or know truth, or what kind of truth claims, for example, with astrology, what kind of truth is astrology rooted in, or how can astrology be true? What kind of reality do we live in that something like astrology or tarot or the I Ching or any kind of divination can be true? In that book by Geoffrey Cornelius, The Moment of Astrology, he really makes the case that not only is astrology essentially divination, but also we should understand what kind of reality allows for divination to be real in the first place. And I think this is really, really important for astrologers to be credible. For, like if you're entering into a conversation with people who are even the least bit skeptical, and you can explain to them, no, astrology is divination, and divination is a different kind of epistemology, that they'll often respect you a lot more. So let's just revisit what that means very briefly. So divination is not, it's very different from saying that the planets are causing things to happen. Okay, so if I draw a tarot card and the tarot card is the death card, that does not, and let's say, it's time for, I don't know, a pet to pass, and it's like, it's a hard card to pull. Does not mean, and no one would really think that it means that the card is causing the animal to die. So similarly, the view of truth that ancient astrologers had, was not originally that the planets were causing things to happen, but that the planets were the signs, the omens, the indicators of the gods. They were, and the practice of astrology, by the ritualistic practice of casting a chart, was, and the chart itself was oracular, and that the reader is a diviner, which means they're reading the signs, they're reading the tea leaves. They're just like you might read liver entrails, or the cracking of a tortoise shell under heat. So we read the signs and we interpret their meaning as an indication of the way that all of the mysterious forces of nature are playing out according to a divine arrangement, or an arrangement that the mind can't, it's much tougher to predict than, let's say, just the purely physical forces of nature. It's much harder to predict what I'm going to do tomorrow than it is to predict what the weather will be like tomorrow. So in the ancient world, there was a recognition that there was a need to be able to address, describe, predict, the occurrences of the human psyche, of human interactions, and so forth. And one of the ways that was always done was through divination. Well, divination, how does it work? How could it possibly work that a tortoise shell could and the way it cracks as it's heated or something like that. How could that possibly give you information? And the basic idea is like this, and this is pretty simplified because it's really complex stuff, but anytime that you can find a closed system in nature, in the physical world, that has a display of meaningful, recurring, intelligent patterns, like the cyclings of the planets and all of their synodic cycles, the sun, solar cycle of the year, the lunar cycle of the month, and so forth. The 64 hexagrams of the I Ching display numerical, mathematical, intelligence, and it's all within a contained system. So they're playing with numbers. They're playing with like a number grid. In the tarot, we're working within a certain number of cards in a number of suits, and like all of that. So similarly, and I told the story in the previous episode, I had a student who collected like 300 movie stubs and put them in a little lunch pail. And for divination, she would open the lunch pail and draw a movie stub. And it was information relative to that movie or actors in that movie or something that happened in that movie that would end up speaking to the situation. But it's a closed system. It's a closed system, meaning that it has to draw on the relevance of the patterns contained within a certain limitation or space. In the same way, we were talking about the way that like in nature, it was talking in the last episode that my wife and I were going for a walk the other day, and she saw a hawk, and it really suddenly spoke to her and gave her an inner sense of knowing about a tough situation that she was encountering. Why is that? Because from the time my wife was young, she has developed a connection with hawks. And I think everyone can relate to this, where there'll be an animal and you see it and it gives you, it kind of can speak to you. Well, lots of cultures have talked about that. In fact, lots of cultures have talked about that. How is that? Well, in that case, it's not that the hawk is literally causing my wife to do something. The hawk is its own agent, it's its own being. But somehow some kind of intelligence can speak through it because it's become a closed symbol for my wife, meaning the closed system is my wife's life, is my wife's biography. And the fact that the hawk it didn't have that relevance to me, didn't speak to me, but it spoke to her because it has a closed system of reference, a closed orientation. So all systems of divination work in that way, where it's any kind of system that has a wide variety of natural patterns that are recurring, that we assign, or almost we don't assign just willy-nilly, but we develop a relationship with those patterns, and we're able to intuit or pull out of them a myriad of archetypes, of first forms, or of omens or symbols. And then the fact that it recurs in nature predictively can be applied to our lives, which play out in nature. And then there's a predictable nature to the seasons and to the solar and lunar cycles and so on and so forth. And we have these 12 signs that delineate the spaces of the circle that they move through, and so on and so forth. So the point is that divination as a way of knowing is not grounded or limited to just one framework, because it's essentially what you're saying is that spirit, or this kind of intelligence, can speak through archetypal intelligence, can speak through any kind of closed system. And the thing is, though, is that closed systems in nature are relative, which means that they're different in different places, different orientations. My wife is a closed system because she's a unique person with a unique biography. The I Ching comes from a certain place in the world, and its symbolic language has an orientation that's unique to its place. But that's not what makes it. That's not what makes it relevant. Anyone can participate in the I Ching. You could use the I Ching on Mars. Same thing with astrology. You have the Chinese zodiac, you have the sidereal zodiac, you have the tropical zodiac. And could you flip the zodiac so that you have all of the seasonal language reoriented to fit with the Southern Hemisphere's view of the language? Yes, of course you could. And would it work? Yes. In fact, one of my colleagues, Theodore Naker, has a Facebook group that's dedicated just to delineating charts that have been flipped to fit the Southern Hemisphere. So of course you could. But what you'll also find him saying and lots of other people saying is you don't have to, because it's not that literal. It's not that the planets are literally causing something, or that the seasonal metaphors of the system are literally causing something, in the same way that the hawk isn't literally causing my wife to have the insight. So the orientation of these systems is relative, is what we're saying, but the truth that speaks through them is absolute in some, and there's something about that tension that's really, mysterious.
Okay, yeah. So I think we've got a really, that was a really, really thorough grounding on, what this idea of divination is. And without trying to simplify it too much, a word that you said a couple of times is language. And that's just been the sort of my kind of shorthand to understand whenever I hear divination, I think language. I don't know if that, fits for you. The question usually for me that kind of brought me to some other places is, if it's a language, then what am I speaking to? Mm-hmm. But that would be too much of I think, a side topic. What I wanted to come back to is, with languages, like with French, English, Japanese, we very rarely question, or some people do, but I don't question where they came from. And I don't worry too much about the origins of the language for it to be relevant to me today. But I think what happens with the Zodiac is, when we hear you talk about how Aries got its meaning, Cancer, Taurus, we freak out a little bit, because we start thinking about the origins, and then we think, well, how does that apply to my friends in this part of the world, or how does that apply to me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. First thing would be, yes, because all systems of divination are the way that divination is conceived of is as a transmission or communication between the gods, spirits, daimons, God in the monotheistic sense, however you want to think about it, and the human soul. And it comes through, that communication comes through the two mediums. One is the medium of the language itself, which is a closed system with a relative orientation. So in other words, it's a closed system of symbols, but its relative orientation in this case was the Northern Hemisphere. And then the second medium it comes through is the sensitivity of the reader, the diviner. And of course, the querent, or the one asking the question, and any conversation that's communicated, between the reader, the symbols, and the querent. So there's often, in readings, there's going to be a conversation that starts happening between all parties. Again, the point is that because it's a language, and the important thing is that the intelligence and the speaking is coming, the information or the instruction or the warning or the encouragement or whatever it might be, because that's coming through this closed set of symbols, and through the reader, that's why it works. But the point is that the relative orientation of that closed system is indeed relative, and is not what makes the truth power of the entire operation functional. It has to have an orientation, but it could be any orientation. The orientation, that's why, specifically why a turtle shell can work as well to communicate truth about the future, describe a situation, as a tarot card can, as a tropical or sidereal zodiac can, and so on and so forth. So people, for example, also have no problem when it comes to understanding that the relative orientation of a religion culturally doesn't matter when this religion A and religion B both teach love thy neighbor, or respect the earth. No one really questions that the orientation of where on the planet that the essence of that instruction came from. And so similarly, excuse me, although the orientation is not irrelevant, like, of course, there has to be an orientation. The point is that the truth, the ability for something to speak through that orientation is not limited by its orientation. For it's a simple way of putting it like this would be to say, you can get a signal on a cell phone in a lot of different from a lot of different positions. The important thing is there has to be a connection. There has to be an orientation between you and the satellite, for the communication to take place on the cell phone. The communication taking place on the cell phone is the point, right? And that there you can establish that connection from a lot of different orientations. And the tropical zodiac is one such orientation. And you don't have to be from the tropical orientation of the Earth to participate in it, right? Mm-hmm. In the same way that, people might end up connecting with a satellite that gives them cell coverage that's in the northern hemisphere while they're in the southern or something like that. I'm just making this up, but and again, you have to remember that behind all of this, the reason that it doesn't matter so much when it comes to seasonal metaphorical imagery that was built into the zodiac is that symbolism is not causing anything to happen. It's, another way of understanding it is like, if you have Saturn when you were born in a summery sign and your sun was in a wintry sign, you're still going to get a Saturn that expresses itself in terms of those seasonal metaphors, even though the time of year was not that way. So mostly we're only getting hung up on the fact that the solar orientation is different from northern to southern hemisphere. And again, you could flip the zodiac if you wanted to, and you'll get great. Like I said, my colleague, he gets great results. My point is that it's really frustrating when you're doing, horoscopes as often as I am, or you're making videos as often as I am, and I will allude to a seasonal metaphor, and people will get all like, "Oh, you're you're northern hemisphere centric," or something like that, and it's like, these complaints, while I get where they're coming from, have missed the point, which is that none of this is causal.
Yeah, and I also wonder about the people. Okay, so they were in, what is it, like effectively the ancient like Greek world, but different parts of what is now
like the Europe, Hellenistic world.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Like, but basically it wasn't, it probably wasn't snowing in the dead of winter there when the system was being created. Am I right?
That's right. More than that, there's the seasonal. Honestly, the ancient view has far less to do with the seasonal metaphors than it does with the exchange of light and dark as a metaphor. So I talk about this at length in my first year program, but when you're talking about Aries, for example, you're not really talking about the beginning of spring like we would think about it in some kind of Easter Hallmark commercial here in North America. You're really thinking about a moment at which the equilibrium between light and dark within a 24-hour period shifts dramatically. And that's experienced in India and in, Mesopotamian region of the world, in Egypt, in Greece, it very differently, right? It's not like there was even consistent relationship with the weather or the seasons across the places that astrology was being practiced. So that's really important. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that we all experience the same patterns of light and dark in the southern and northern hemisphere. The system is identical. It's just oriented, upside down. So what I tell everybody is, I've been doing this for 10, 11 years. I have never once had problems with inaccuracy with my clients from the southern hemisphere. I've done thousands of charts of people from South America, Australia, South Africa, like probably at least a couple thousand of the charts that I've done have been from the southern hemisphere. I've never had a problem describing or predicting very specific. And I think if you listen to, my Australian colleagues in the astrology world, they'll say the same thing. They're not reorienting the zodiac. Now they might, for example, they could meaningfully talk about things that are happening seasonally with light and dark, where they are living, and weave that into, their symbolic storytelling as an astrologer, maybe on their YouTube channel or whatever, they could flip the zodiac. I'm not against any of that. What I'm against is people saying you have to, because when they do that, they're making a big mistake. They're starting to literalize and concretize something that will stop working if you do it that way. It literally will stop working if you try to, when you try to concretize the relative aspect of something that needs to remain relative, you'll get into big problems.
Yeah, it's almost like when you try to figure it out a bit too much and you stop paying attention to, I don't want to say what makes it, because I think if somebody's really drawn to using a flipped zodiac, surely they should, because something is telling them to do that.
Yeah. If they feel intuitively drawn to using a flipped zodiac, if you feel intuitively drawn to using a sidereal zodiac, if you feel intuitively drawn to using a particular house system, all of that stuff are really just the relative orientations of the language. They're all very flexible in that regard. And, I think that people should be intuitively listening to how do you want to make your system? How do you want to ground it? Those choices, the relative choices that you make are, they're kind of like the lightning rod and where you're choosing to stick it in the ground. But the important thing is that it's the lightning rod and it's the lightning that make the connection, and they're willing to do that wherever you put it. It's just the deciding upon where to put it is ritualistically significant. It's psychically significant, and so I don't think it's a problem or that people couldn't reorient however they want, which is the same reason why in the other video I said if people wanted to create a new language on Mars, a new astrology on Mars, that new relative orientation, a new view of the zodiac from a different place would still yield truth. I have no doubt that it would.
Yeah, it's just, I guess it's something that happens with astrology or many other practices and worldviews is we get our intuition, we try to justify it, and then we try to convince other people why they should also follow that. But I don't think it's necessary to do that.
Yeah. The main thing is not making it necessary. That's the important thing, because once you try to make the relative orientation of a system like divination, you get fundamentalist about it. That's when you really start losing the thing that matters, which is not so much where you've put the lightning rod, but the fact that you have a lightning rod and that there is lightning, right? So it's a tricky conversation. The other thing that's important to remember is that systems of divination are in and of themselves archetypal, which means like all things in nature are archetypal. So when ancient astrologers are thinking about, let's say, the nature of the zodiac, they're not sitting here and going, let's derive a zodiac from nature. When they start noticing the belt of the zodiac, they're saying that zodiac exists as a reflection of something primordial, so a primordial archetype that is eternal, that has no beginning or end, that manifests itself or shows itself here. So the seasons themselves are caused by archetypes, not that the seasons cause archetypes. It's reverse thinking. So that's also important for understanding why the orientation can be relative, because the archetypes will show themselves in any relative orientation and creation whatsoever, because they come first, and that the relative is the emanation of those first principles. So it's just kind of reorienting our thinking about them.
Great. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. Hopefully you won't have to answer that question again.
I know. Well, we made this video so that every time I get the question, we can literally be like, watch does the zodiac need to be flipped video? So, and then they can, people can hear my thoughts on it and, feel free to disagree, obviously. But so make sure you check out that book, The Moment of Astrology by Jeffrey Cornelius. It's a really good book. If you want to learn more about everything that we're talking about, epistemology, divination, things like that. Thank you, Kat, for being here. Check out Kat's work on thecreativeintrovert.com. She's got a lot of really cool things that she's doing, and has a lot of really interesting people that she talks to. So be sure to check her work out, and we will be back again soon for another Q&A episode. All right. Take care, everyone.